He was released from Robben Island at the age of 25. That would have been, if you count 10 years after 1963 of his arrest, it would put it in 1973. So many of the juniors not yet born at the time. Again, his professional career started in 1976 as an attorney's clerk at the Pretoria law firm Dyson's and later at the law firm Clutch Brown Incorporated, or Clutch Brown Incorporated. However, like Duma Nokwe, his entrance to the legal profession was not easy. In his words, he says, he was determined to move the system to be admitted as an attorney in South Africa and not to overseas. And his application, incidentally, was opposed by the Law Society at the time. But in rejecting the Law Society's opposition to his application to be admitted as an attorney, the panel of 3 judges admitted him in 1978. He practiced in partnership with the law firm Maluleke, Shiriti, and Muslimek. And there I gave you an insight into Aquino's identity. As an advocate, he was called to the bar in 1983 and practiced as an advocate at both the Johannesburg and in 1993, he was appointed to serve on the technical committee that drafted the 1994 interim constitution. So he was one of the founding, and he says, fathers of our constitutional democracy. But he did say there were also mothers. So there were founding fathers and mothers of our constitution. He used the definition, well, like many others, of the phrase I have coined, from rejection to a coveted person, from incarceration to liberation. In 1994, there's still the sound in the background. In 1994, and at the specific instance of our former President Nelson Mandela, our keynote speaker was appointed Deputy Chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission that conducted the first democratic elections in South Africa. He acted as a judge, and whereafter he took a detour, went into the corporate world for greener pastures, I suppose. He was then, after spending some time in the corporate world from 1995 to 2001, came back to the profession, this time going to the bench, and appointed the charge of the Pretoria High Court. The very same division at which he was sentenced for 10 years at Robben Island. He talks about the judge who has sentenced him, that the judge was still there. A gap of some 40 years between the two of them. The judge was about to exit in his 80s, made a tea, and when you are a new judge or an acting judge, like at the bar, you have to go greet the senior who have been at the bar or has been at the bench. So he will tell us whether he did honor that practice as we do at the bar and at the bench. In November 2002, he was appointed a Justice of the Constitutional Court, where he later became Deputy Chief Justice of the Republic from June 2005 until his retirement in May 2016. It's a period of 15 years at the Constitutional Court. He has contributed immensely to the legal profession. Shall I cut it down? I will cut it down. Immensely to the legal profession. He's the founder, and not only of our constitutional democracy, but the founder also of the Black Lawyers Association and NADEL, which is the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. Then there's a long list of the honor and the doctrines given to our keynote speaker.
He's asking me to put a chart, ladies and gentlemen, he's the author of 2 books, expressing his lesson on war, my own liberator, and all rights, all rights in judicial war. So I'm going to read it all later. So keynote speaker, retired. I'm so just not able to stop me. I start crying, but thank you ever so much.
I have been, and as long as some colleagues here, Albisex has been justice. We have been justice. In Kabinde, we are taught SG to write every word. So when we debate with you, we can say, well, look at what I actually said in my judgment. So I'm going to do that right from the beginning, by and large, to the end. And hope that some young people one day would care to find the time to go and read about one of our greatest leaders. And one who arguably would have urged me on to become an advocate. I won't keep you long, but I hope you have time to listen. I'm truly delighted and privileged to deliver the Duma Nokwe Inaugural Memorial Lecture this evening. Excuse me, I attribute my presence here to the dogged but polite persistence of the Duma Nokwe family. Because I believe it, they made sure that they talked to me directly. And the Duma Nokwe group of advocates. I'm grateful for the invitation from the Duma Nokwe Foundation also, and from the group leader of Duma Nokwe Group of Advocates, Senior Counsel Bude Sedeka. Good evening to you all, starting with the Duma Nokwe family, judicial colleagues, legal practitioners, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed many comrades who I have seen here and spent the better part of my life waging a struggle against colonialism, apartheid, and oppression. I acknowledge in particular Albisex and his enormous dedication to our quest for freedom and for a just society in our land. Great to see you, Albi. I've had the privilege of serving with Albisex over a decade on our highest court, appointed SG by the ANC government, by the end. And even after his retirement, Albisex has remained an invaluable lodestar in our country and in our thought engagements from time to time. I saw you 3 times in 3 weeks, I would say. On 2 of the occasions we're lecturing established young students at law schools. That's where Albisex and I were in the last 2 encounters, now the third one. So it's wonderful to see your colleague. I acknowledge Justice Kabinde, with whom too I served on the highest court for more than a decade. She's now a justice of the highest court of appeal in Botswana, and that is where she now lives most of the time. I also recognize Justice Mjapelu, Deputy Judge President, all my other retired colleagues who are present, counsel, senior and junior, legal practitioners, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed, comrades and compatriots. I'm respectful of the past and present leadership of the African National Congress, and significantly, I acknowledge your presence, Secretary General Kilimbalula. It's more than appropriate that you hinted at it. I'll speak about it later. Kalandwe Mesofi de Brain, Comrade Mafusong Simang, and indeed I've seen a number of other senior comrades here. Please pardon me if I don't mention by name. Siddiq, I appreciate your courtesy of informing me that the developments are currently underway for the repatriation of Duma Nokwe's remains from Zambia to South Africa. The family added also today that the repatriation is envisaged to take place before the end of August and the burial ceremony to follow during this month of September. So in many ways, it is appropriate that we raise the flag in honor of Advocate Duma Nokwe. It is so that Duma Nokwe toiled for our liberation in exile and in Zambia in particular. But it is also appropriate that his final resting place be located in this, his place of birth. On an occasion such as this, I cannot resist repeating the mantra I have written a few years ago, and which I will now recite. It speaks to why we honor others and why we grant them public acclaim. We do it for both altruistic and selfish reasons. Dr. Snooking. We acclaim them for their own sake, but also for our own sake. And I'll explain in a moment. It is so that every people, every nation, and indeed every village or township from time to time yields from amongst its very own a truly courageous, selfless, and visionary patriot who stands tall and apart from the rest of us. The rest of us look on and would know that that person and his or her deeds are truly virtuous and worthy of celebration. We want to remember their achievements or sacrifices for many reasons. First, they are beacons and signposts of public good. Their lives light up the collective path we want to travel and must travel. They locate us within our past and shared experiences that they endured to make our lives bearable. There's another forward-looking reason for celebrating the brave and ethical lives. From the lived moments of our heroes, we hope to learn how to prosecute our own lives. We call to memory their visionary and selfless action to gird our own loins for the challenging task of reimagining and recreating our world. We hope to extract from their brave deeds those abiding values of how best to accomplish present-day challenges. Of course, we also remember ethical and brave patriots for no more than to thank them for the sacrifices they have endured to make our lives bearable. But who is Duma Nokwe? Philemon Pierce Dumadisile Nokwe was born on the 13th of May 1927 and lived a most eventful and meaningful life spun over only 50 years. You would want to guess that he lived 100, but only 50 years, until he passed on in exile in Lusaka, in Zambia on the 12th of January, 1978. Duma grew up in a working class circumstance. His father was a shoemaker. He attended primary school at Everton and matriculated at the Anglican School St. Peter's in Rosettenville, Johannesburg. Like other enterprising peers of his time, Duma Nokwe then proceeded to the South African Native College, to be known as the University of Fort Hare, where in 1949 he obtained the BSc degree and a year later a teacher's diploma. In 1959 he started teaching mathematics, as you've heard, in Krugersdorp at a secondary school. But before then, Duma Nokwe was involved in the formation of a branch of the African National Congress Youth League at Fort Hare. Once he returned to the Transvaal, as this place was called then, he remained an active member of the African National Congress Youth League. And in 1952, he became chairperson of the Orlando branch in Soweto. Expectedly, he participated in the Defiance Campaign of 1952, something the apartheid regime would not let go without visiting adverse consequences upon him. The apartheid government immediately suspended him from teaching in a public school. Fortunately, he obtained a teaching post in a private school. He needed the income. From that point onwards, we observed Duma Nokwe's activism within the African National Congress ramp up, and the response of the oppressive regime being even harsher. In 1955, at an early age of only 32 years, you are listening, SG, he was elected the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress and Secretary of the National Working Committee. Only 3 years later, he was elected as Secretary General of the African National Congress, a position he held until 1960. In 1954, Nokwe was slammed with a burning order that restricted him to Johannesburg for 5 years. The restriction was extended in 1959 for a further 5 years. Even so, Dumadisile continued to take part in the African National Congress resistance campaign against the implementation of Bantu education in 1955 and other campaigns, some are volunteer. Government banks might have sought to curb Duma Nokwe's political activism, but in truth did little or nothing to stand in the way of his professional designs. Through extramural study, Nokwe obtained the LLB degree at the University of the Witwatersrand, and in 1955 was admitted to practice as an advocate, as you've already heard. Those are very dark, dark days for oppressed people. An evil conspiracy of the Group Areas Act, the Native Urban Areas Act, prevented him from occupying chambers, as you've already heard, and using the common room and other communal spaces in the same building as other Johannesburg barristers. to the total shame of most of the members of the Johannesburg Society of Advocates, Advocate Seleka, of the time, did not raise even a whimper or protest. Instead, many conveniently looked away or faked ignorance, but a few, with Advocate Nokai Toby mentioned. This meant Dumalisile had to be a squatting advocate. He was a squat advocate. In my own Liberator, I take the liberty of recording this despicable disgrace and blot on the history of the Johannesburg Society of Advocates in the following words. A few people of color and women had been members of the Johannesburg Bar before 1960. Ismail Mohammed was one, and Philemon Pierce Dumalisile Duma Nokwe was another. Although both were members and qualified advocates, they could not take up chambers in the communal space reserved for practicing advocates. Because the chambers were located in a so-called white-only area, both occasionally squatted in the chambers of sympathetic white colleagues, and most notably, Advocate George Bezos. You saw the clip earlier. Both Ismail Mohammed and Duma Nokwe were men with ample talent, with ample character. And over time, I record, they were to become household names, as they indeed are now. Perhaps one day, a Duma Nokwe group of advocates, as you are in search for silk, and I'm excited by that, you'll find it in you to demand a fulsome, public, posthumous apology from Johannesburg Society of Advocates. For the disgraceful omission of your predecessors to do the right thing by protecting their members from unjust racist laws when it matters most for what is to become Chief Justice Ismail Mohammed and Advocate Duma Nokwe, the Secretary General of the African National Congress. I return to the gripping narrative of the life and times of our celebrant Duma Nokwe. The apartheid bans and restrictions prevented him from traveling freely to attend to clients, to prepare for cases, and to appear in court, at any rate on a regular basis. But perhaps the biggest disruptor of his professional life, as you have heard, was in 1956. Nokwe was arrested and indicted for high treason, with 90 co-acquists who were mainly leadership of the Congress movement. The treason trial was to last for 5 years, until 1961. Duma was one of the last 30 accused in the treason trial, and an unofficial member of the defense team, led by Izemezos QC, whose name you've heard earlier, together with the star-studded team of juniors, including Sidney Kentridge, Vernon Berenger, Arthur Chaskelson, and George Bezos. So Duma was in a real celebrated space. All remaining 30 accused were acquitted of high treason. This meant he worked with some of the most competent progressive practitioners of his time, but he himself could never adequately practice. And here is the rub for Duma Nokwe's narrative. By the end of the treason trial, 6 years later, and his discharge from high treason, his own legal practice had entirely collapsed. Again, an advocate who never was allowed by the system to practice his craft. The 1960 PAS campaign, I must say this, led by Mangaliso Sobukwe, the president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, interceded and changed much in the lives of activists across the board. The PAC and the ANC were banned. Both were exiled. Thousands went to prison, and many other thousands went to exile. Peepy, squeaky, little me, small, 1963, I also went to prison. In 1963, as I went to Robben Island, Duma Nokwe skipped bail and fled into exile and joined the ANC in exile. He was intensely involved with campaigns to recruit support for the African National Congress, with attempts to effect a comprehensive economic boycott against South Africa. However, ill health forced him to resign his position as Secretary General in 1969. By 1974, he was again active in overseas opposition politics, and at the United Nations, he advocated that South Africa be suspended from that body. In 1975, he was again appointed Deputy Secretary General, as well as Director of International Affairs for the ANC. And if you're old enough, you would know that he periodically broadcasted over ANC Radio Freedom. I'm not sure how old you were then, SG, but we listened to that quite often. Now, Advocate Nokwe was a crafty author. He was a gifted and talented human being. He had immense gift of the brain, and he wrote ample political articles for newspapers and art magazines. And he was often described as tough, witty, urban, and one of ANC's finest politicians. Duma, like most of other freedom fighters, as I've said, had a working class background. He knew and understood the implications of an impoverished lifestyle and inequality and exclusion which many African people of his time had to endure. In this very short life of no more than 50 years, he compressed it into relentless campaign and fighting in order to change and alter his and circumstances of all of us. As though that were not enough, as I've said earlier, he was indicted for treason, only to be found not guilty after 6 years. And the irony of his circumstances is that he trusted and had faith in the ability of the law and the organized profession to produce just outcomes and a fair society. And yet, for him, it never simply happened. And unsurprisingly, he left the country, joined Umkhonto we Sizwe, and in 1978, he succumbed to illness away from home, and a home that was still in bondage as he passed on. So what do we new young lawyers make of the life of one so totally talented and so tenacious and so dedicated? Duma Nokwe is undoubtedly one of the ancestors of African advocates. On his shoulders, Tembega we humbly stand. From his heroism, we have amply benefited, whilst he did not. We see it under the glory of the light that he shared, and that he never had occasion to bask in. From his stoic steadfastness, we, the younger generation that came after him, learned how to pursue righteous and just outcomes to the very death. That I certainly learned from him. And we therefore have been truly privileged by a life so fully and well lived. Duma Nokwe well understood the interplay between individual and collective agency. I must prosper as we prosper. something which Bonam Mohali describes as lift as you rise. Against all odds, he procured the LLB in circumstances which were totally dire. Even so, he ensured that he's admitted as an advocate when the odds were truly against him. Once he thought it was done, he was rejected by his colleagues who wouldn't let him in, save for George Bezos, and by people who often claimed to be members of the honorable profession and purveyors of just outcome. He made the inevitable decision, even though law practice had its initial allurement. And the decision was he would prosecute the fight for freedom to its fullness and put law practice on the back burner. In other words, he put on pause his professional quest. He followed in the worthy footsteps of other great South Africans. Think for a moment about A.P. Mda. Think about Mswake Dimbede. Think about Oliver Reginald Tambo. Think about Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela. Think about Albie Sachs. Think about Bram Fischer. And indeed, think about Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. But Duma would expect the present-day barristers to make different elections that he made. He would not, like him, ask you to elect wholesale combat of democracy, equality, and freedom, and thereby abandon your law practice. His time demanded that, and not yours. But I'll tell you in a moment what your time demands from you. Yes, Duma Nokwe would demand that barristers equip themselves with the law, that they stay and remain diligent, and that they know how to practice the craft. That is the craft of practice, excuse the pun, in order to intervene for and serve those who need legal assistance most, assist courts in arriving at just outcomes, and for the broader society to enjoy just arrangements. Yes, Duma Nokwe would insist on truly and honorable practitioners, not only in name, but in deeds, not only in their gowns, but in the worth that they bring to our society that needs that ever so much. Duma would hope that you, particularly young lawyers, you, his progeny, would keep a fresh and open mind on the socio-political context within which you practice law. Duma would hope that you would care deeply about a functioning, just, and equal society, whatever your definition of that is. He made his definition and decided to fight what confronted him at his time. Duma Nokwe would want you to seek a present, effective, competent, and ethical state. And I move on to look at a number of things which I believe he would have whispered in the ears of all of these young lawyers in our profession. And what he would have said about our democratic project, Secretary General, what he would have said about the judicial and the legal profession. Duma Nokwe did not have the privilege of seeing the dawn of our democratic transition. He was not here with the dawn of our democracy. He departed from this world, as I've repeatedly said, young, early, and in bondage, well before 1994. Even so, he was a full-blown Democrat. He would have been the first one to want every one of us to be able to cast our political vote and select the leaders that we prefer. He is the one who would have shouted, as he often did, when defending the Freedom Charter. I read how often Africanists would taunt him and he would have to defend the Freedom Charter quite often, SG. And he would shout, "The people shall govern," quoting the Charter, obviously. So if he would have understood that a vote confers public power on office bearers. But a vote is also capable of taking away public power from recalcitrant public office bearers. That is the potency of the vote that Duma Nokwe fought for so hard. Duma Nokwe would have been the happier that we, the electorate, now after 30 years, understood better that democracy thrives on insecurity and not security of tenure. In other words, Duma Nokwe would have been pleased that the electoral behavior was mellowing in ways that hopefully let the people and not office bearers govern. Duma Nokwe hated inequality. He hated social unevenness. He would have wished for each of us substantive equality. I don't want to digress to tell you how he traveled the whole Eastern Bloc, learning how the world could be different. That's a topic for another day. He would have hoped that each one of us, if not each family, whichever way you describe it, would, as a bare minimum, have the little mercies of a home, of running water, of power supply, of easy access to quality schooling, and of access to necessary health care. He would thus have hoped that when the people govern, that the bare minimum will be afforded to them, particularly the most vulnerable amongst us. Duma would have known that much of our inequality was indeed spawned by our horrific past of apartheid and colonialism and capitalism. He would have known that. Even so, he would have pointed out to us, his compatriots, the things, the public goods we promised, but we failed to deliver. He would have been exasperated to no end by things we failed to do and the difference we could have made in the last 3 decades. Duma Nokwe would have wished us a present, competent, tangible, palpable, and accountable state. The first and primordial task of any state is to afford protection to its citizens from harm to life and limb and property. Forget the fences. That is the primary function of the state. Duma would have hoped for a present, accountable, as I said, competent state that would be accomplishing this first primordial and primary task. We deserve to be spared the wrath of violent crime, of pervasive extortion, of gang bosses firing away just about every other next minute, of organized crime, of activities of drug lords. Duma would have wondered how we have unleashed femicide on our women and daughters. How do we get it right to kill so many of our very own? And he would have wondered, as I do often when I listen to the police statistics, which show that the fault lines of crime and poverty are staggering. The poor have the least protection to life, limb, and their meager possessions. He would have wondered about that because he often said, let the people govern. Duma Nokwe would have battled predatory, huh? It's predatory ruling class and thieving elite even harder than apartheid colonialism. He would have felt the affront just as strong as he felt the affront of apartheid colonialism and the exploitation of capitalism. I suspect he would have stood where I stood and welled with the same anger that often wells up in me. He would have thought all of us must understand that we cannot be inimical to our own people, lest we look like our erstwhile oppressors. Tumilisile, like many of us, like Albisex, like Wamgab Mbeki, like Jafta Masemola, like O.R. Tambo, who spend our lives in arduous search for a just society, and in Duma's language, who would have joined in a search for a better life for all, are in volemic shock. And we wonder how we landed where we have landed. I'm done with my sermon. Law enforcement and the judiciary is what I'm going to talk about, and I want to sit down. You are right, Advocate Nokwe Toby. We need a competent governance arrangements girded by the rule of law. Try a lawless society and see what you'll get out of that. Democratic governance must be conditioned by rules and shared values, and not at the whims of powerful women and men. Laws are there to constrain public power and to ensure a rule that is just and consistent with laws made properly by the representatives of the people. Remember, the source would always be the people. People make laws, and judges get invited to enforce laws made by the people. We sometimes get confused about that, as though judges make the laws. They simply implement them. The notion that rule of law is a neo-colonial fetish is utter nonsense. We need rules, we need laws, we need to observe them as we seek to achieve a just society. Our constitution is not perfect, but trust me, it contains adequate, essential provisions to be able to bring us fairly close to a just society of our dreams, provided we follow it. We need a competent, effective, and accessible court system. And Duma Nokwe, who was a member of my profession, would have asked for no less. We need courts that are independent, that understand the context within which we as a society operate and are trying to achieve. But those of us who support effective courts, we reject the unfounded campaign to malign the judiciary over and over again without adequate facts demonstrated in each case. Judges in themselves are not important. They're public servants. I was a public servant for 15 years. But here it is. They are totally indispensable. They're as indispensable as a referee in a soccer match or in a rugby match. You may not like the referee, but hell knows you need the referee. Otherwise, you can't play the sport. The profession must, I invite you to join hands in protecting the institution of the judiciary and our law enforcement agencies. The profession chairperson has gone moribund. We hardly hear your voices. We need the institution, we make it better, and it will not be better unless we have clear support of the profession and reinforce the value of courts. Even the worst amongst us, the first port of call is to come to our courts. SG, open up your television every morning, you'll see what? Magistrates and judges on their posts doing their work. They wake up every morning to go to their posts in order to hear cases before them. So we need proper allocations. Court buildings look miserable. They're poorly maintained. And we get into a crunch when we need more judges. And we're going to have to think about that as a society. Vital part of a competent state is an effective and competent courts and law enforcement system. My parting shot to you, young lawyers. Many of you were not born anywhere near the life or during the life of Duma Nokwe. If he was alive, he would have been 97 years. He would have turned 100 in 3 years. We made choices that were imposed on us by apartheid. He did, we did. And here's my plea. Prosecution is vital function given where our nation is. Practice at the bar was always glamorous for years, but we need the brightest and the youngest to go and become prosecutors in order to protect our democracy. We need them to join in law enforcement entities and be as smart as the crooks who are threatening and endangering our democracy. And together with the bar, I'll be making suggestions that we actually go and try and recruit young people and hope that the government will find the budget to have many bright people start their careers as prosecutors, as law enforcement officers. Otherwise, we're going to be overwhelmed in our democracy. But SG, hope springs eternal. No movement lives for over 100 years, and suddenly dither. I leave you with a thought. Inkonde yomsabalalo ndim. I've been around a few corners. We're going to have to go and work as hard as we can. We're going to have to regenerate the things that we were there for from the beginning. We're going to re-emphasize those values that are most important and that our people cherish most. And in doing that, we will surprise all of us and preserve the legacy of over a century. I thank you for listening. Aluta continua.
Thank you very much, former Deputy Chief Justice, for those poignant and powerful words, words which will undoubtedly linger with us for many, many days after the day is complete. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to a short comfort break. Please help yourselves to some refreshments outside, and we will recommence promptly at 8 o'clock for our question and answer session. Thank you. 8 o'clock.